Good afternoon, Gareth, for our almost weekly podcast, episode 4, I think we're on now. I think we call it the weekly crypto financial promotion section 21 approvers podcast or words to that effect. We're going to
Yes.
find something that works better, I imagine, over time.
I don't think anything will
It
work
doesn't,
better than that.
it's
So I think we'll stick with
descriptive
it.
and it's punchy. So I'm Wayne Green, co-founder of Engelbert.
And I am Gareth Malna, the other one.
Good. So this time, I think we're looking a little bit more, are we not, at something for the product builders, the people in the background that are making all this stuff work, and a little bit on the frictions renewals, because we're coming up to 1 year, certainly since the build started, and we're about 3 months from 1 year since the regime came into being. So we're getting around to that 12 months renewal piece for the frictions for customers, and then a little bit about what we've learned through that process of building. So I think there's been a lot of learning since by everybody, not just by us, including the regulator, and we've heard a little bit about that, so we can cover some of that stuff. There's going to be some data needs for that we could talk about, and then perhaps lead nicely into the Consumer Duty Board report, which will be more meaningful to us as regulated businesses than people that aren't regulated, but no less of an impact for us, and that's due in just over a month's time at the end of July.
I can see that what we've done neatly here, Wayne, is we've brought in a whole load of content that the product builders will want to hear, and then ended it off with something that they absolutely won't want to talk about. But
I think they will enjoy hearing about the consumer duty stuff. If I use words that are not related to regulations and put it in business terms, we could always put a bit of a positive spin on that.
Let's do it. Okay, so let's talk then about what product builders might be thinking about at this time of year, given that it's coming up to 12 months since probably they started building the first time round, depending on when they started thinking about this regime. But I think the thing that's going to hit people at the 12-month mark relates to those frictions, those 4 frictions that were probably a bit of a pain to build for right at the outset. And as a reminder, they were the personalized risk warning, the investor categorization, the appropriateness assessment, and the 24-hour cooling off period. If you think about customers who were already signed up to maybe your product or your service, when the regime came into effect, what the FCA said was, if you already have a customer that exists with you already, you don't need to do the personalized risk warning and the 24-hour cooling off period. You can just do the appropriateness assessment and the investor categorization. Those are the 2 frictions that matter for us, for your existing client base. And I think it's probably also relevant to say that at 12 months, when you're probably also looking at refreshing your KYC records, you should also be recategorizing or getting investors to recategorize themselves with you. So checking that they still meet high net worth thresholds, sophisticated thresholds, whether they are in fact meeting their obligations as a restricted investor not to invest more than 10% of their net assets in the last 12 months. And probably also just checking that they still understand what they're doing with you. So reissuing that appropriateness assessment is one of the other frictions to go through with. And of course, to do that, probably you've got a data piece to think through, right? Because it's important to know, firstly, when the user first joined you so that you know when 12 months is up for them. Perhaps it's also important to know what categorization they set themselves, or how much of a percentage of their assets they said they were going to invest, and whether their behavior has actually mirrored that in practice, something you probably ought to be keeping under constant review. And of course, then there's all the reporting things that the FCA originally requested as part of the approver financial promotion workflow, which some of them got reeled back on. Things like, how many people saw your risk warnings, how many people clicked through to the risk summaries, how many people completed the frictions, how many didn't, how many got the answers wrong to their appropriateness assessment. So there's all these little things, right, that form part of that general onboarding flow, some of which at this point in time, I think we're due for renewal of coming up to 12 months. And if you haven't built those workflows into your product to ping a notification to a user to say, hey, it's 12 months since you categorized yourself, can you do it again, please? Then it's probably time to start thinking about building those at this point.
It's probably helpful as well to put some of this into context as to why it might be that this has to happen, and it's probably fairly self-explanatory, but we'll touch on it anyway, is that we're assessing, or the firms are assessing, what customers understand about the products they're getting into and the services they're getting into, and their own position financially from a categorization perspective. And of course, those things can change over time. They can change because people have got into something that they thought they understood and were able to demonstrate even that they understood, but perhaps have dabbled and now maybe don't, or maybe circumstances change over a year, financially or whatever that might be, and we have to reassess those things to make sure that these, which are categorized high risk investments, therefore there's more of a touch point once a year to make sure that all this stuff still stacks up for them, as opposed to just the one and done. You said it was fine at the outset, we'll believe you and not come back to that.
That's exactly it. And then, of course, there's a bit about, in that period from when you say to a user, oh, your categorization is due for renewal, your appropriate assessment needs to be taken again. There's a question mark as to whether you suspend services to them at that point, you allow them to continue trading for a grace period or indefinitely until they recategorize themselves, or which point on that spectrum you sort of position yourself. And I don't think we've had much in the way of guidance on that yet from the top of my head, and I should probably bring the rulebook up at this stage to identify what it actually says. But ultimately, there is some thought to be put into that decision. If a user has come up to 12 months and we've said you are due to recategorize yourself, you're due to take that assessment again, do you stop serving them at that point until such time as they complete that? What that leads us on to a little bit is the data needs. And what's clear to us is that the FCA certainly likes that you're able to collect data on users and their behaviors. And we've seen that in meetings with them. And being able to show them, hey, look, we know exactly when the users completed their categorization, we know what they said, we've had a way of ongoing monitoring the thresholds that they set themselves. We've looked at their understanding. We knew, for instance, that they had taken some of our educational materials on board when doing those appropriateness assessments. And we've logged all of that data on their records. So we know lots about them in terms of how they're interacting with us, how they're categorized with us, and how they're using their product. And I think partly that drives a support journey as well. We'll come on to why support matters, I think, probably at the end when we look at consumer duty.
Yeah, data has been for 2 or 3 years at least now a big thing for the regulator, for the FCA. So they talk a lot about data, and it's interesting seeing how different firms in different sectors react to that, because there are some firms who just don't have a lot of data, and then there are others who have so much data it's difficult to know what to do with it, how to read it, where to store it, where to analyze it. That brings a whole host of problems in its own right. In this context, we're probably a little better off because it's new. So there isn't 20, 30 years worth of data to try and sort and validate and put into some sort of organized format that can be read. It's relatively new. It's built on tech, obviously. So that's a good start, right? We've not got people rooting through archive boxes in a paper warehouse to get details out. But then, as I say, having lots of data is useful, but understanding why you need it, so that use of data to see who has been with you for how long, how they categorize themselves, what their appropriateness journey looked like through the assessment the first time round, and therefore who needs to revisit that and do it again because the time is up, how you interact with those people to set that process running. But then also using the data to show how your journey is working and what your customer base looks like. And that actually is we say this a bit, don't we, about some of this stuff. We need that for regulatory purposes. So you can't get away from that. That's black and white written down. It's got to be done. But likewise, isn't it helpful to know anyway what your customer base looks like and how they're reacting with this stuff? And this is probably one of the areas that the crypto industry in particular is probably a little better at than some of the traditional finance, where there is more engagement with what customers are doing, who the customers are, how they're behaving, and a greater ability to use the technology and the data to gather that information and to read it and spit it back out the other side of the pipe. So it's it has been a big thing for the FCA, and the reason they like data in particular is because it means that it's not just this sort of subjective, we think everything's fine, this looks pretty good. It's actually rooted in hard evidence, and it's the evidence that they like, and that's why having good data that's gathered and stored and read well and accurately is important, because it gives evidence, which is another big thing for them.
And of course, I speak on behalf of your lawyers when I say, obviously, make sure you use data in accordance with your data gathering policies and whatever you've told users you do with it. So, yeah, that's your legal warning for the moment. And as you've seen neatly, we are in our office today. There are people here, and they'll be moving around in the background. But to lead that on slightly, I suppose we can move on to the sort of things we've learned about builds, product builds over the last, 3-6 months, and kicking off probably at that appropriateness piece, and in particular the things that you are asking users for. And so, as a reminder, you've got to be testing users' knowledge and understanding of what you're selling. That's really important, because if they don't know what they're buying from you, then it's probably not appropriate for them. And yes, you might just be listing one token, but you'll remember that the token is classified as a high-risk asset in the same bucket as illiquid stocks and lots of other fun investment types that are very serious and straightforward and come with black and white documents of prospectuses. You have to make sure users understand it from a pure exposure to their financial portfolio perspective. You're asking a lot of them to come in and give you some of their investment portfolio that they could be looking to retire on, which is ultimately the way the regulations have been formed and the premise on which the whole regime has been built. And so you need to ask the questions that come from the guidance produced by the FCA, and I will give you the boring reference number. It's COBS 10 Annex 4, which lists 12 topics that your appropriateness assessments need to cover. And the question is, how many questions do you ask in order to guarantee that you meet all 12 of those topics? And what is your pass rate for those questions? And you're going to have a job on your hands to explain to the regulator why it's okay to have only 5 questions and allow users to get one wrong, when that could mean that they're not demonstrating understanding of 2 or 3 or even 4 of those issues in the list of things you have to test for.
I think we've not landed on a final definitive result there, have we, in terms of question numbers versus the information, the assessment, and what it has to cover. But I think the general theme that we've arrived at, that we're using, is the fewer questions you incorporate, the higher the pass rate is going to be. So if you're going to go for a lower number, you're going to look at maybe 5 or 6. If that's enough questions, then you're going to expect 100% pass rate, because the chances are, if you get one wrong out of only a list of 6 questions, you've probably answered incorrectly on a fundamental risk or feature that you're expected to understand versus a wider set.
Yes, absolutely. And let's not forget that the list at COBS 10 Annex 4 is a guidance point and not a rule. And so there is a chance that some of those issues won't apply to you and your business, and therefore it's okay to skip them. But you've got to make a conscious decision to do that, and you've got to justify that. And so that's about record keeping internally. So as far as your product build goes, we are expecting some guidance from the FCA any day now. Generally, about the implementation of the frictions. But one of the things we've learned from that process is make sure you've got a reason why you haven't perhaps required a user to definitively pass all 12 of those issues, if indeed you've covered all of them at all, and why you thought or may think that it's appropriate not to ask, 7, 8, 9 questions in order to attack all of those different aspects on the list. So that's the first one. And then we've got the journey, the frictions journey. So Wayne, do you want to talk about prominence throughout that journey?
Yeah, again, it's sort of a balance between the user experience through the journey and making sure that you are actually assessing properly people's understanding of what it is that they're getting into, and from the categorization perspective, how they categorize themselves. And the sort of feeling, I think, when you start to look at regulations, particularly if you've not been around them before, or in this context, is that it feels like it's trying to slow down and stop things. It sort of feels like we don't want people to pass through this, and that's the approach. But we know from speaking with them, with the regulator, that they don't want to stop people getting through the frictions. They want the frictions to work effectively. So they want the frictions to be a good way of assessing what people know, and they want the categorization to be accurate, and they want people to understand what it is they're selecting or entering when they're going through that information and putting their responses in. And so then you start to get into the sort of more nuanced discussion around to what extent can we do things to make this a good, easy journey for the customer, but not do that so much that we're actually coaching and guiding and making sure that they get through the process, because that's what we want them to do commercially, not just because it's the right thing for the customers. And we have some debate on this, and I don't feel like we've had many cases we've experienced where people have gone too far into the coaching, guiding, completing for you bit. There's certainly been some fringe cases, but not what I would call sort of intentionally doing things for people so that they get through it. It's just a judgment where, one person thinks one thing looks fine and someone else thinks it doesn't quite look that way. It's just different perspectives, and that's all good learning for us to do. So there's the how the forms, particularly the categorization bit, there's a little bit more to do there than just the direct answering of questions, but how the forms help customers to complete them without doing that so much that it becomes, no, don't put that, put this, because that's how you'll make sure you get into the next step. But we've seen some good examples of that working, and there's been one or two where we've rode back a little bit, but again, not because it was way over the line, just because it was looking at it from different perspectives, considered by one group to be too easy and another to be perfectly fine. And then that starts to, with the understanding with the assessment questions, starts to lead then into to what extent you're educating people so that they understand what it is that they're getting into and if it's right for them, versus coaching, which is not really permitted, and particularly the kind of coaching that takes place during the assessment itself. So to give a real obvious example, if you ask someone about the lack of FSCS protection or FOS involvement in crypto, and the question is there any? And you click yes, there is, and a pop-up says no, there isn't, go back and answer it again. That's coaching. That's going to be too obvious and too simple. But that's not to say that you don't want people to know what the protections are. And so actually the alternative is to let people go through the process, for example, for them to understand that they didn't get the right pass rate that you've agreed and documented internally is the pass rate that needs to be done. And then you can take them somewhere, take them elsewhere to learning pages, videos, tutorials, whatever that might be, where that information exists and is present, and they can go off and learn themselves and then come back and redo redo the assessment. So I think if it feels too easy, if it's too not enough clicks almost, this is one of those areas where you do need a bit of reasonable friction for good purposes. If it's too easy, too obvious, if it feels like a daytime game show question where the answer is very, very clear, and if you get it wrong, we're going to give you the right answer anyway, so you can go back and click it, then you've probably made it too simple. Really, it's just making sure that people take some effort to go off and learn the right stuff or complete the right information categorization, so we know that they're answering truthfully and not just trying to navigate the questionnaire so they can get the end result they want, regardless of what they say in the meantime.
Yes, exactly. And then linked to that actually is the sort of education piece around it. So what we know is that you can create an education bank, you can share that before the test, you can give people access to it if they fail the test. And importantly, actually, what the FCA seem to like the idea of is if you track the metrics of that. So, hey, you failed the test, and then you took the assessment again, and this time you passed. Log that, because that talks to the success or otherwise of your educational materials. Now, there's a line at some point where education stops being education, it starts being coaching. So, of course, what you don't want to be doing is, for instance, recreating the question language or the answer language as a copy and paste into the education bank. That would look a lot like coaching. But if you talk generically about the risks, operational, financial, volatility, all those things as part of your education bank, then really what you're said to be doing is equipping users with the knowledge that they need to actually engage with this stuff, and that can only be a good positive outcome that people understand what they're doing. So the educational piece is superb, and another point in terms of like data collection on which we were talking about earlier. And then the last little bit of that is things like the design of your buttons throughout that flow. Might not be something you think about particularly from any perspective other than design UI type perspective. But at the end of that frictions process, or at the end of your investor categorization, when you confirm a statement, you've got the option to agree and proceed or leave the investment journey to use the regulatory landscape. And if you give prominence to one button over another, that won't meet the outcomes of the rules. And so the idea is that you create as much parity between the journeys as is possible to give, really. Ideally, those buttons look exactly the same. And the times that you might be able to deviate from that relate mostly to creating a holistic visual identity for your product, so that if at some stage users always know that a red button means go forwards and a black button means go backwards, for instance, you can start to think about that as potentially a reason why the continue towards the investments would be in big and bright and red, and the leave the journey would be in a sort of more muted black color. But that's a case by case specific thing to think through, and one that there's no hard and fast rule, except you should be giving equal prominence to both options. And so if you say leave the journey and a pop-up comes up that says are you sure, again, are you showing that same pop-up when you're sending people forward towards the investment, so that you can say, hey, we are giving this equal and due prominence.
And that comes down to,
so I think that's everything I had.
I guess that comes down to behaviours. So behaviours is again something that gets talked about by the regulator, and it sounds meaner than it is, preying on people's behavioural patterns. It's not always the case. I don't think it's often done deliberately, but there are certain things that happen that just compel people to continue a journey that they've already done. They think it's the right button to press, but look, it's the biggest, brightest one, so it must be the one that I'm supposed to press. And so they just do it. And certainly we know, don't we, that when anyone goes on any website that has terms and conditions to accept, everybody just scroll. They're just looking for the agree button. They're not reading stuff. And it's along those same sort of lines, right, where you know what people are inclined to do. Take the line of least resistance, or the one that gets them where they think they want to be, and so don't make it so easy that they just sail on through without really thinking about what it really means.
Sorry, I lost you there when you paused, but I'll mark this bit of the podcast to cut out, and we will start for the final section in 3, 2, 1. Yeah, exactly. And so, and I think probably, Wayne, that leads us nicely on to our last topic of today, which is your favourite, consumer duty, and what that means, particularly in this context. It's worth stating before you eloquently educate everyone that watches, as you always do, on consumer duty. I suppose the interesting policy piece that exists around this regime, which is consumer duty as a set of rules that apply to authorized investment firms. And if you're a crypto asset firm who is unauthorized in the UK, you might be forgiven for therefore thinking that the rules don't apply to you. But they actually have to get passed down to you through your authorized approver. In this case, us, if you are a client of Engelbert. And so the rules are an obligation on us that we then pass down to clients. Sorry. That we then pass down to clients to make sure that they comply. Meanwhile, theoretically, if you are a money laundering registered firm with the FCA, the consumer duty rules don't technically apply to you. And so you have this slightly two-tiered system where a directly registered AML firm would not be subject to those rules, but a client of an approver who's unauthorized in the UK would be. And I suspect that will be a policy hedge that does get sewn up at some stage and wrapped up into a more concise position. But for now, think of it as the cost of not being directly registered with the FCA. And so, without further ado, Wayne, what is consumer duty and why should product teams care?
So, consumer duty, I have often tried to put as positive a spin on this piece of regulation as I can, but that's not been too difficult because having dealt with loads and loads of new pieces of regulation, consumer duty is the one where I can most closely see how it relates to running an actual good business. Because what it basically says in a nutshell, although it doesn't use terms as nicely as this because it's still regulation at the end of the day, is what are your products and services? What would a good outcome of those products and services look like? What do people pay in total to access those products and services? And are they getting value as a result? Do your customers understand what you're buying and are they being supported? So those are the 4 outcomes that consumer duty looks at. Then there's a piece of cross-cutting rules, but we won't go into detail on that because that's a little further removed still from the clients of Section 21 approvers in particular. But when we look at those 4 outcomes, we're thinking, well, actually, if I'm a marketer, for example, or a business strategist or a CEO or whoever I might be in a business, it's probably a good idea that I understand what my products and services are and that somebody wants them and that they work properly. That doesn't seem like an unreasonable ask. And it's basically asking for that, but using regulatory wording just to make sure it doesn't sound too exciting. And then the price and value, again, is, I guess, if you think of it in the extreme, not profiteering. So ripping people off, making them pay loads of money, using, as we talked before about, customer behaviors, trying to capitalize on that to get them to overpay for stuff, hiding fees, basically delivering poor products and services with bad outcomes to people that maybe can't afford it or could get something better value elsewhere that's more suitable for them. So yeah, I need to know what my pricing strategy is and whether I think I'm delivering good value to customers, because that just seems like good business sense. And then the second 2, support and understanding, pretty closely related. Do people know what they're buying, and are they being supported once they've bought it or on their journey into buying it? And again, it doesn't seem like a terrible ask to do those things. But of course, it's a regulation, so there's a whole bunch of requirements that sit around those things, which is data is a big one. So use data to analyze those things, how well you're doing against those 4 outcomes, and then lots of evidence and lots of reporting. And so as an authorized firm, at the end of July, we will be required to have a consumer duty board report that opines on our success or otherwise with meeting those consumer duty requirements, and then using data to measure it and evidence all that stuff. So as Gareth says, it's you're by virtue of using a Section 21 approver at least kind of caught by proxy to this piece of regulation. Now, the regulation is very principles based as opposed to very prescriptive. So it leaves a fair amount up to the firms to work out how they're going to do this, what it's going to look like, and even the extent to which it applies to them. And so in this world, because we have, as a Section 21 approver, little to no influence over the products that are manufactured, and little to no influence over the price that's charged for those products, then we don't have the responsibility of the consumer duty to meet those two outcomes. Caveat that by saying that we can't ignore them completely, because it wouldn't be good for us as a approver of financial promotions to be approving something that is vastly overpriced, horrendously poor product or service that's causing people harm. So we have to have an eye on it, if not the influence and therefore the responsibility to take action if we think that our analysis find is not a good product or it's too expensive. So we're, I would say, mindful, if not actioning anything. Support and understanding are more important for us, because understanding clearly is part of what we're doing by reviewing the promotions that we approve. And so we're looking at whether they are clear, fair, and not misleading. We look at the language that's used. We look how readable it is. And then to Gareth's point earlier, which squares the circle nicely about the data requirements, we can then see how successful that's been. So if you've got good learning tools, people coming into the assessment questions, passing them, if not first time, then second time, because they're able to go away and learn stuff, or leaving the journey because they're finding out through their education that it's not right for them, then that's all good information. And so those are the things that we'll be looking at in particular when we do our own board report. So it's not quite the prescribed labour-intensive piece of regulation that the financial promotion rules are for crypto asset firms, where you've got to do great big builds of frictions and warnings and et cetera, et cetera. It's a little more, shall we say, it's subtle in its application, and it's to you guys than that. But where we don't have information already, then we'll start to be, or we are now, looking at it. And of course, because what we're doing is approving promotions that are going out to the wider world, and we have them available to us anyway, because we're already looking at them and reviewing them, a lot of the information we need is already there. So we have people that go off and do little assessments for us of websites and journeys and language and what does this all look like versus the consumer duty rules and guidance. And in a nutshell, that's consumer duty and how it applies. So yeah, if you're a fully authorized firm making your own products, then much bigger thing to worry about. For us, still a big piece to worry about, but manageable. And we are new as a sector, as an industry, so we have less legacy to be concerned with, and we only apply it to the extent that we have influence over the outcomes that investors experience, not becoming a full regulator by proxy.
So if you don't know, now you know.
There you go, in a nutshell. If only that was as quickly as it was articulated when it was put into rules, but there we are, rules are rules, and always nice to try and put some usefulness behind them and put it into a different context, which is easily done for this.
Amazing. Thank you. And so, I mean, on that bombshell, I think we could probably wrap it up there. And so, for this week, that is the pod.
Thank you very much, Gareth. See you next time.